So, I think that now we are connected. Now you can hear me. Can you all hear me? Yes. Well, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are tuning from. Welcome all, and thank you for being here. It is a joy and a privilege to be hosting today such an extraordinary gathering of friends in this second edition of the International Colloquium Constellations of the Ordinary, to celebrate Stanley Cavell's life and work on occasion of the 3rd anniversary of his passing. Stanley is, without a doubt, one of the most important, certainly one of the most prolific and original American philosophers of the 20th century. His singular and incomparable writings, which range from ordinary language philosophy to film, from Wittgenstein to Emerson and Thoreau and Shakespeare, have the power to touch people, not just intellectually, but also, how to put it, existentially, personally, attesting to the great depth of his philosophy. And it is also an amazing fact about his writings that not only are they able to cross national and cultural boundaries, we have people in this event from the US, of course, but also from France and Finland and Spain and Brazil and Peru. They have also the power to bring together people that are so different from one another that the community that gathers around his work is increasingly plural and multifacetic. I think we will have ample evidence of that too in the months ahead, as we listen every 4 weeks for the next 6 months to our guests talking about the many issues and topics and perspectives his words have inspired amongst us. Reading last night from his inexhaustible autobiography, Little Did I Know, I found the following comment Cavell left in 2004 that serves as well as an introduction to this colloquium. There he wrote, "Some friends of mine feel that too much of the writing about my work comes from the sense that it is insufficiently read, either too narrowly or too hastily, and that if it were just explained a little bit more clearly, its readership would suddenly become fruitful and multiply." Well, I am sure that every presentation during the following months will contribute not only to adding more depth and focused attention to the work surrounding his writings, but to cultivate and spread his rich and very timely thought. So, we begin today with Avner Bas and Byron Davies, who, although speaking from 2 very different places in Cavell's repertoire, will both be talking about the world. Avner stressing the importance of the ordinary language approach and deepening it by appeal to Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, while Byron will show the pertinence of Cavell's thought for experimental film today as it attempts to express or represent what Byron refers to as a receding world, a world coming apart. We will proceed as follows. Each presenter will have 30 minutes to provide us with a statement of their claims, after which we will follow with 20 minutes of discussion between Avner and Byron and the 12 other speakers in the colloquium. And finally, we will open the forum to the audience for another 20 minutes of discussion. So if you are in the audience, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box as Avner or Byron speaks, in Spanish or English, it doesn't matter, and we will pick from those questions for the discussion in the last part of our session. So let me leave you now with our first speaker, Avner Bas, who teaches at Tufts University in Massachusetts and is well known for his spirited and lucid defense of ordinary language philosophy. Today he has entitled his presentation, "The Problem of the World in Analytic Philosophy." Avner, please.
Thank you, Victor. It's good to see so many friends. I even get to see Nancy, a rarity. But I didn't prepare a 30-minute presentation. I was going to assume that people have read the paper, and I was just going to say a few things by way of introducing it, though, I could conceivably go on for 30 minutes. So it's interesting for me to think about what work I find myself doing at any given moment of my philosophical life, and how often the work I find myself doing was not something I expected to be doing even a year or two earlier than that. I certainly wasn't planning on spending about, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 years of my philosophical life defending ordinary language philosophy. When I came to Tufts, I had very different kinds of interests, but I was just responding to what I was getting from my new philosophical environment. And this led to work that I wasn't expecting to do. And I found myself coming back to aspect perception again and again on various occasions without ever planning in advance that I would be doing that. And now this work, which in some respects is so, is not as explicitly existentialist as I have come to think of my work. All of a sudden, I'm interested in measurement and speaking with my colleague, George Smith, about measurement in physics. And at the same time, making my Wittgensteinian friends worried that I'm becoming too theoretical, and which, must mean that I'm producing nonsense, to which I respond, go ahead. I mean, show me where. But I'm not going to let that kind of Wittgensteinian, I've come to think about it as a kind of religious devotion to something people attribute to Wittgenstein. I'm not going to let that stop me from pursuing what I feel I need to pursue at any given moment. I want to say something about Stanley, because I mean, as I move to this new line of work, in some respects, I'm less immediately drawing on or responding to or inspired by Stanley, but only slightly less immediately and directly, because really when in response to some of my Wittgensteinian friends, I have to justify or explain why it is that I've been doing this kind of work recently, and why I give it the title of transcendental idealism. I say that in the end of the day, what I'm responding to because I'm seeing it everywhere in contemporary analytic philosophy, is the philosopher's failure to acknowledge the ways in which we're implicated in anything and everything we do in the world, as it is reflected in our theorizing, including our scientific theorizing. And so this really is what I think Stanley came to think of as skepticism. I mean, this failure to acknowledge our contribution to the meaningfulness of our words, but also of our world. And this fantasy that Stanley somewhere describes of having language and the world speak to each other over my head without my having to take responsibility for that conversation. So when I'm responding to something that I'm calling transcendental realism, this ultimately is what I think I'm responding to. This tendency of the philosopher to leave him or herself out, as Stanley, I think, would put it. Now, the reason I found myself engaged with this kind of work is, well, first of all, that, teaching in an analytic department, one hears the notion of the world thrown around all the time, be it in philosophy of language or philosophy of perception or in moral philosophy, or when philosophers talk about philosophical method, everybody is throwing the notion of the world. And my general sense, my hunch, is that the way in which that notion is used in contemporary analytic philosophy is confused or inherently conflicted, because it seems to me that philosophers want, on the one hand, to be talking about the world as paradigmatically understood by the natural sciences, maybe even just in physics, and at the same time want to think about it as a world as it is in itself. So thereby not taking to heart what I take to have been maybe the fundamental insight of the critique of pure reason, that the empirical world is not a world as it is in itself. More immediately, I found that when responding to my criticism of some recent work, for example, in epistemology, the response is always, why should we really care about what we say when and under what circumstances and what we would mean if we said this or that? We are exploring or investigating items in the world, is what the expression often is. And for example, specifically in response to my recent work on method, we are interested in knowledge, in the relation people stand to propositions when they know them, or when they know this or that. And I have found myself saying in response, you're thinking of knowledge as if it were a thing in itself, in the Kantian sense. You're thinking about it as if it does not depend in any way on what we care about and how, and against what background when we speak about knowledge, or when we say, I know or I don't know this or that. So this then led me to my current interest in arguing for something that I'm calling transcendental idealism. But I'm not wedded to the title so much. I do want to acknowledge a debt to Kant, and in a sense that I'm in a way going back to the beginning of my own philosophical career, because I started with Kant and then discovered Wittgenstein and spent a few years, a good number of years, articulating certain dissatisfactions with Kant from a Wittgensteinian perspective, mostly having to do with what I thought of as Kant's neglect of the importance of the point of a judgment or the point of an utterance, and then spend several more years articulating certain kinds of dissatisfactions with Wittgenstein from the perspective of phenomenology. And now I'm finding myself going back to Kant, because when contemporary analytic philosophers, either responding to my work or not, talk about the world, I want to say to them, you know what? Forget Merleau-Ponty, forget Wittgenstein. You are doing philosophy as if Kant has never worked. And therefore, of course, as if Hume has never worked. And so I feel like maybe that's where I should start. And then there was this encounter between Kripke, Naming a Necessity, and Wittgenstein's remark in Philosophical Investigations 50 about whether or not it makes sense to call the meter standard in Paris, to say that it is or that it is not 1 meter long. And Kripke thinks Wittgenstein is just wrong, that of course it is 1 meter long, and it might not have been. And in particular, a paper by Cora Diamond in which she reflects on this encounter between Kripke and Wittgenstein led me to think that this might be a way to anchor, a place to anchor my own thinking and my own response to what I see as the repression of the Kantian insight in contemporary analytic philosophy. I think I'll stop here. again, I'm assuming that people have read the paper, but if not, then I could say a little more about this. Oh, yeah, maybe I should say this, that another good reason to focus on Kripke and Wittgenstein is that naming a necessity is arguably one of the places, one of the texts, one of most responsible for the recent, dominance of transcendental realism. I mean, Kripke allegedly liberated pre-Kantian metaphysics from the shackles that the epistemic shackles that Kant placed on it. And so that would be a good way to go back to where it, in some sense, all began recently. The other thing I want to say about Cora's paper is that I had not read it until recently, and I think it's a masterpiece. But I was at that conference in Champaign where she first presented it. And Tal, my wife, and I drove down from Chicago, and Tal was very pregnant, and it was, we had just come to the United States. And mostly what I remember from the conference is that this is where I first met Stanley, and we had coffee with him, and he was extremely generous with us with his time. But the other thing I remember from that conference is just the picture of Cora Diamond standing in front of the audience and putting her hand on her head. This is how tall I am, as a way of capturing the kind of illusion that she identifies in Kripke. And I think that this gesture I find extremely useful for bringing out the kind of confusion that I think ultimately underwrites transcendental realism. I mean, this idea that just by attending to things, they will describe themselves, as it were, without your involvement, just by looking at them. You'll see how long something is just by looking at it, without any reference to yourself, right? So that's the fantasy that I think is captured in this gesture. And I remember Cora doing that. That's the only thing I remembered from that talk until I recently read that paper. Yeah.
Well, you still have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to ask you to elaborate on something you mentioned at the beginning, sort of to cover your time, and then I can say
also something about the third section, about why the need to go to Merleau-Ponty.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, and to connect it a little bit to what you said about seeing aspects at the beginning.
So it's interesting for me, reflecting on my work, how despite my my finding myself moved beyond pure therapy, and thereby alarming my Wittgensteinian friends, beginning with my work on aspect perception, maybe, I still find extremely satisfying the therapeutic moments. I mean, in some ways, they are the most satisfying for me. I mean, they're the cleanest. So when you're responding to someone else's words, in this case, Kripke, and really try to offer the kind of diagnosis that ideally would lead the philosopher to say, yeah, I guess I don't know what I was trying to say. Or I guess there is a kind of confusion, or something like this. I mean, it's not going to happen, but I mean, it's a nice ideal to have when I engage with another person's work. So this is where section 2 of the paper ends, right? And in a way, I'm happy with where it ends. And many of my Wittgensteinian friends say that's where it should have ended. But summer was coming to a close, and I say, if this is all I have to say about magnitude and the perception of magnitude, as if there is nothing to our concept of magnitude beyond what Kant says, that that you need a unit and you need standards for those units and practices of applying those standards. I would be repressing and in effect denying the significance of the experience of magnitude. I don't need any standard, anything like an objective standard to be struck by the size of something or by its distance. I don't want to be denying that. And of course, from Merleau-Ponty's perspective, and this is what I try to bring out in that third section of the paper, if our pre-objective, pre-reflective perceptual experience wasn't already meaningful, wasn't already communicating to us about ourselves, as it were, for example, in the size that things present to us, then our conceptualizations will be empty. So there is a way of rethinking and elaborating on the Kantian basic slogan that concepts without intuition are empty. But now the concepts are empty, not because you're not, as it were, applying them to particular bits of sensory intake, which can't cause intuition, but because you don't place them in a human world and in the context of a human practice, which is based on experience. Not just, you know, the objective size of the table, but what it feels like to be sitting around the table, to be cramped around the table, to be left out of a meal because, you know, the table is too small. I mean, apart from that, I mean, to be told that the table is 2.2 meters long would be empty in just the way that I think Kant thought it was. But what makes it not empty is not exactly, I think, what Kant had in mind in the first critique. And yes, Victor, I mean, this level of pre-objective, pre-conceptual experience is, I think, what comes out in aspect perception. And I think, I mean, in recent work on aspect perception, that's what I'm proposing, that the significance of aspect perception is the way in which it brings out perceptual sense and unity that are not, or not yet, conceptual or conceptually captured. It's a dramatic way of bringing out the contrast, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, between knowing and seeing. Yeah.
It's very interesting because it makes, well, it changes the world, as you say, in introducing this effective sort of sensible perception of things. It changes the world into something that's not just made out of objective qualities or merely subjective qualities, but also aspects. Perhaps that's interesting. We still have. You're making me change the whole structure of this, but it doesn't matter. How about we use the 10 more minutes that you have for any questions that our friends might have? Otherwise, we can just go on to Byron's presentation. If anyone just right now, sort of hot and warm from what he said, otherwise we just go on to Byron. Yes, Nancy.
Avner, thank you. It's so funny because Avner and I are colleagues in the same department and we never see each other, even really on Zoom. Avner, I'm going to ask you the question publicly that I always ask you privately in some form, which is, there are, I think, important social and political ramifications of the views that you're expressing, with which I heartily agree. And I found this paper really compelling. And the sort of surprise that Kant is a helpful someone it's helpful to refer to in these circumstances is quite interesting over and against contemporary analytic philosophy's understanding of what things are. Let's put it that way. But I would love to see you move this more into a realm that affected our lives politically, socially. We're living in a time now where that's, I think, an imperative in academia. And so I just wanted, I would love for you, as you know, so I'm just going to say it publicly, to move from Merleau-Ponty to Beauvoir and see how the way that she has her eye on, at the same time, the same, I think Toril has beautifully argued, and I've followed on her heels, of being profoundly helpful in understanding things in a way that's congenial to the perspective that you're using, which I also associate with Stanley. And at the same time, speaking not just to philosophers, but also to everybody in a way that I think is desperately important, especially given where the world is right now.
Thank you, Nancy. The first thing I want to say is, will you help me do that?
Yeah.
Do that work?
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say.
How's that for an easy out? Go ahead.
Yes. The other thing I wanted to say is, it's very interesting to me that I'm doing this, because I mean, the previous work I was doing just a year ago is a paper on moralizing, and also inspired by Stanley, but going in a very different direction, and showing how contemporary moral philosophy tends to be moralized, tends to reflect the language of the moralizer, is how I want to put it. So here is the thing, here is the dilemma. And Nancy, you know me for so many years, so you will understand exactly what I'm talking about. On the one hand, you want to take it as far as you were suggesting. I mean, taking those insights and that approach as far as you were suggesting it needs to be taken. But on the other hand, by then I will have lost contact altogether with much of what my students, for example, are encountering in other courses, right? So I find myself moving back and forth and saying, you know what? You're not going to even listen to what I say about the way in which knowledge, the word, functions in discourse, or about moral discourse, because you're so wedded to this idea that physics has the final word about the world. Okay, so let's talk about physics. Let's talk about length measurement. And the idea is that maybe if I, as it were, come that close to the analytic philosopher, engage them that closely, but you know, that's just my fantasy, they will not be able to ignore me anymore. And Stanley, when I was publishing my first book, he was extremely worried about me, because he said I was operating under this fantasy that if only I articulate the argument clearly enough and with sufficient patience, I will get the typical mainstream analytic philosopher to even listen. And he said he was worried that it will break my heart. So the good news is that I'm not as troubled now as I used to be by the fact that it's mostly ignored by the people I'm striving to communicate with most focusedly.
But you had that piece in News, which is really, really, wasn't it in News? Didn't you get something?
The paper on moralization is coming out in Mind, so that was a nice surprise.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank
you. Spreading Stanley's word.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We must move on. I was just reminded of something that Cavell said, that philosophy becomes political when things begin to go haywire, I would say, out in society. I think Jonatas and Juliet, could you please hold your questions for after Byron's, but don't forget to ask them, please. So Byron is just recently graduated from Harvard and is presently a postgraduate scholar in UNAM. No, well,
Sort of. I'm also kind of back at Harvard this semester.
yeah,
It's
okay.
complicated, but
So you're on both worlds, and he's going to talk also about the world, but the world from the perspective of film, and in particular how Stanley's thoughts on film can be used to understand experimental film, especially as you say, in the face of a receding or falling apart world. So please,
yeah.
Byron.
Well, thank you, Victor, and thank you to the other participants, also Avner. I'm very happy about this consonance between our two topics, or possible consonants, even though I will be talking quite a bit more about Cavell's writing itself in connection with film. I'm in Mexico City, where I now live. I want to say thanks to my friends in Lima. Les mando mucho cariño desde la Ciudad de México. Les mando muchos abrazos, muchos saludos a un lugar, Lima, una ciudad que quiero mucho, y un país, el Perú, que también quiero mucho. Tengo muchas ganas de regresar a Lima muy pronto, en cuanto sea posible, y en cuanto termine esta pandemia horrible. Entonces, les mando mucho cariño, muchos abrazos y saludos desde acá. Muchas gracias. Okay, back to English. So I'm concerned with some questions about what have perhaps been some impediments to a full or thorough encounter between Cavell's film writing and experimental film. And there's already some really excellent work done in this regard that I am indebted to. So there's a really excellent essay that came out quite recently by Dave Burnham on Cavell and experimental film, focusing on the American avant-garde and questions about the supposed about Cavell's conception of nature and how it applies to the American avant-garde. Sorry, just a moment. It's that something in the screen just changed, but I think it's okay. Okay, yeah, okay, sorry. So Dave Burnham's work is really excellent, and I am indebted to that. What I'm focused on is found footage film, and that is film relying on archival sources or fragments from other films. So a method very often associated with the history of experimental film in the American avant-garde and elsewhere, and I'll be talking quite a bit about elsewhere. And what I think is possibly what has been an impediment to a full encounter between Cavell and this kind of film, it has something to do with what I call in the essay, in one of the two essays that I shared with the group, and I am presupposing some knowledge of those essays, but I'm also presenting a summary of both and how they fit together. What I call in my essay on found footage, Cavell's global holistic approach to what a film is. So that can sound kind of like a criticism that Cavell has a specific approach that constituted an impediment to this encounter with found footage film. But what I'm also arguing is that there's a loosening or changing of the structure over time in Cavell's film writing that allows him to give greater attention to the expressive potential of something other than a whole film or a film as a whole, and instead something more like collections, the expressive power of collections. And so I also need to acknowledge that there's already some excellent writing that I'm indebted to on Cavell's, what I'm calling Cavell's global holistic approach in his film writing to the notion of the world in the world viewed. Or the notion of the world as a meaningful totality. Martin Schuster's excellent work on the Heideggerian background, Heideggerian resonances of the notion of the world and the world viewed. I'm very indebted to that. Also some real excellent recent work by Daniel Morgan, taking up the notion of the world as a meaningful totality in the world viewed and how that's connected to questions of photographic realism and in the world viewed. I'm very indebted to those questions. So I'm not, when I'm talking about the loosening up of the structure, I'm not talking about the loosening up of that, or the loosening up of that notion of a world exactly. What I'm instead interested in is how this global holistic approach informs Cavell's conception of what a film is, at least in his early film writing. And I think there are some reasons here rooted in Cavell's conception of modernism. That is, if we can't appeal to traditional or guaranteed terms or features of a work in criticism and criticizing that work, we have to depend upon an evaluation of the work as a whole, or in this case, the film as a whole. And there are, so then the question is, what conception of a work as a whole is operating here, or of a film as a whole? And I should make clear that I think that a lot of Cavell's deepest critical insights in the worldview are informed by exactly this approach to this global holistic approach. For example, his wonderful reading of Truffaut's Jules and Jim in the worldview is informed by this question of how to situate, how to make sense of the use of freeze frames, seemingly isolated, otherwise isolated use of freeze frames in that film, in the context of the film as a whole, in the context of how it's situated, meaningfully situated in the entire film. But like I say, well, obviously what can yield deep critical insights in one domain can also constitute an impediment in other domains. And I think that that's the case here when it comes to Cavell's global holistic approach as it relates to found footage film. And so fortunately, we do have some attention by Cavell that brings this out to a specific found footage project. In his 1979 essay on Makeveyev on Bergman, Cavell describes a presentation from the previous year by Dusan Makeveyev, the filmmaker from then Yugoslavia. He presented at Harvard at the Carpenter Center a found footage project of moments of silence taken from 9 Ingmar Bergman films. And I was, in fact, even kind of curious whether, given this illustrious group, whether anyone may have been present, anyone here may have been present for that presentation by Makeveyev that Cavell attended, and that he writes about at the beginning of his essay on Makeveyev on Bergman. So Cavell's treatment of this found footage project by Makeveyev is a very serious treatment of questions of reappropriation in film, the reappropriation of images. At the same time, Cavell demonstrates this kind of telling anxiety about whether to call Makaveyev's project a film, even though Makeveyev himself called it a film in his notes to the project. Cavell prefers to call it a work of criticism. He's more comfortable in that vocabulary. He has this question about whether this is a whole film according to his conception of what that is. This can, so this raises the question, some questions having to do with, again, that conception of a whole film or an autonomous film. He uses the vocabulary of autonomy in the Makeveyev on Bergman essay. And it seems that there's this picture here where the 9 Bergman feature films figure as autonomous wholes. And the Makeveyev project is, in contrast, heteronymous. It's somehow subordinate to the 9 autonomous features, and which Cavell, I think, is depending on in calling it a work of criticism. He can only understand it as or he prefers to understand it as commenting on the 9 Bergman films, as opposed to allude to where I'm going in a moment, as opposed to a collection with expressive significance of its own. So I think this is one of the fullest statement of the way in which Cavell's global holistic approach to film constitutes an impediment to a full encounter with found footage film. But then, of course, my argument is that impediment goes away. And this one quite interesting question is whether this reflects a kind of self-criticism on Cavell's part. In any case, it reflects a grander trajectory, I think, in his writing on film. And there are a couple different factors here. One, I think, has to do with the receding of modernism as one of, or if not the major issue in Cavell's film writing in the years following the publication of the world viewed. This is something remarked on by Jennifer Fay and Daniel Morgan in their introduction to this excellent recent issue of the journal Discourse that they edited, and that contains a couple of the essays that I just mentioned, the Dave Burnham essay and the other essay by Morgan. And so so I think that there are issues here about how with modernism receding as an issue, the questions about that changes the shape of some of his global holistic thinking as it applies to film. So that's one possible negative condition for the receding of this global holistic approach as applied to films. The second more positive approach, which I really want to focus on more, is a more serious turn to Austen, to J.L. Austen in Cavell's film writing, in Cavell's later film writing, and especially how to do things with words. And this is, of course, bound up with other issues having to do with Cavell's more increasingly serious engagement with how to do things with words in his later writing. Some of it having to do with his response to Derrida, signature and context. But the reason why I think it's important to turn to Austen as the positive condition for this shift in Cavell's thinking is to think that perhaps his sense of a whole film, which had some constraining features, as I was trying to argue, the sense of the whole film as the bearer of significance gives way to something more Austinian, or that is something closer to what Austen calls the total speech situation. That is, if it seems that if what we're really interested in are the various kinds of contexts that allow for speech making without having some specific idea of what a whole film is, that opens up the structure considerably, so that we no longer have to focus on questions about whether, say, Makaveyev's project, found footage project, was a film or not, whether it abides by some standard of some standard or picture of what a whole film is. We can instead turn to questions about the expressive powers of Makaveyev's collection. That's what seems opened up by Cavell's, what I argue is Cavell's more serious engagement with Austen in his later film writing. And then, so the culmination, I'm arguing, the culmination of this line of thinking in Cavell is his later essay from 1998, The World as Things, Collecting Thoughts on Collecting, where collections become the focus as far as bearers of significance, not whole films, but rather collections. And also it's in that essay that Cavell talks about films that, or audiovisual projects that foreground their sources in archives, including also, well, fictionalized archives, but I'm thinking specifically of his discussion in that essay of Chris Marker, of Marker's film Sans Soleil, but also by allusion, Chris Marker's In Memory CD-ROM from that era, which Cavell talks about. So now Cavell's structure is much more open. He's talking about CD-ROMs. He's talking about CD-ROMs or collections of footage, including found footage, as bearers of expressive significance, as opposed to whole films in anything like a constraining sense. So I want to argue is that the other side of this is, of course, Cavell's greater attention to how to do things with words in his later writing, and whose culmination is, of course, his essay on passionate utterances. So another thing I'm trying to do is draw attention to some ways in which Cavell's late writing on collections and his writing on passionate utterances are complementary. They were written they were published just 2 years between each other. And this idea is centered on the idea of a collection as being a vehicle for or basis for passionate expression, or the expression of passion. And then another reason why this is, I think, important as it bears on Cavell and the possibility of a connection between Cavell and found footage film is that it's not unusual for film theorists, for writers on film who write on found footage to connect that kind of film to speech acts. So William Weiss, distinguished scholar of found footage film, his book Recycled Images, foundational book on found footage films, focusing specifically on on the American avant-garde. Weiss connects found footage film and the idea of say taking a filmmaker's taking footage out of an archive in order to say something with it, to Emile Benveniste and Benveniste on speech acts. And it's another issue here is that writers like Weiss, Jay Leda, a foundational writer on the compilation film, Jamie Barron, who has a more recent book on archives, on archival film, they are very attentive to the use of footage for emotional or passionate effect. My suggestion is that Cavell would just be a better framework, or not just, Cavell would be a better framework for approaching that a connection or analogy between saying something with footage and speech acts, specifically through the connection that I'm trying to bring out in Cavell between the communication between found footage collections and the communication of passion, and related issues having to do with the connection between the communication of passion and self-understanding, self-interpretation. I think Cavell provides a rich framework for these kinds of writers. And so then I end that essay on found footage with a brief reading in light of these themes of a found footage film, or a film that draws heavily on found footage and that thematizes the notion of archives, much like as in Chris Marker, but I think there are very distinctive issues in this film. This is a film from 2019 called Monolito by Bruno Varela, a Mexican experimental filmmaker from Oaxaca. So when I close my opening remarks in a moment, I do want to kind of bring together how Varela's Monolito is connected to these issues, including these issues having to do with Cavell's global holistic approach. But I do want to mention that in turning to Monolito, I'm drawing on my other essay, the other essay I provided the group, which is an essay about Bruno Varela as a reader of Stanley Cavell. So this is my essay, The Spectre of the Electronic Screen, Bruno Varela's reception of Stanley Cavell, which is coming out soon in a volume edited by David LaRocca called Thinking About Movies with Stanley Cavell. A number of others in the group here also have contributions to that same collection. So the background for this work is that when I saw Varela's film Monolito in 2019 at the International Film Festival of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the FICUNAM Film Festival, I started to think a little bit about ways in which it seemed to touch on some ontological issues in Cavell's film writing. It was also a film that I really wanted to see because I had known Varela a little bit from my time living in Oaxaca. So I really wanted to see his film, and then something kind of clicked after seeing this work. And so when the opportunity arose for me to write something about that, I wrote to Varela, telling him what I was thinking about, and he surprised me, but also it was a very it was a very refreshing connection that he established in that he told me that he had already read some things by Cavell, and this seems just too good an opportunity to pass up, or that is, this seemed too good an encounter not to explore further. A filmmaker, audiovisual artist, video artist like Varela and Stanley Cavell, and Varela as a reader of Cavell. For lots of different reasons. One is that if there already has not been a thorough encounter between Cavell and experimental film, there certainly has not been a thorough encounter between Cavell and Mexican experimental film or Mexican video art. The thing is that Varela is also one of the most significant and prolific, highly prolific. He's a highly prolific filmmaker, one of the most significant experimental filmmakers working in Mexico today. I know we decided it would be too complicated for me to share images, but I'll share in the chat the his Vimeo page, because most of his work is very accessible for free on his Vimeo page. So I'm just going to share that in the chat in lieu of providing images of his work myself. But also Varela is a very important synthesizer of film and philosophy in Mexico. He's very attentive to questions about the nature of video. Also very attentive to political questions having to do with well, his background in indigenous broadcasting in Oaxaca and Bolivia. He spent many years in Bolivia. Notions of community video, and also very importantly, the 2006 Oaxaca popular uprising, the so-called Oaxaca commune, in which city functions were taken over by a popular uprising led by the teachers union in Oaxaca in 2006. A very, very significant political movement in Oaxaca that bears its mark on Oaxaca and Mexican politics to this day, but also bears its work indelibly on Varela's work because he is constantly reusing and repurposing his footage from the 2006 Oaxaca commune, the 2006 Oaxaca popular uprising. So he's constantly reusing and changing, altering those images to new effect. And so, okay. So when it comes to this essay on Cavell and Varela, in talking with Varela about his reading of Cavell, he told me that the work by Cavell that he was most familiar with was The Fact of Television. And that seemed even more interesting. Because this seemed like a particularly unusual way of approaching Cavell. He had first read The Fact of Television in a collection called Video Culture, edited by John Hanhart. And that seemed like a refreshing and new way of approaching Cavell as a philosopher of the electronic screen. And again, this is interesting for a number of different reasons, especially because Varela is himself someone working with the electronic screen, working with video, working with the idea of video. And with this background in community video and indigenous broadcasting, and with this keen attention to the social and communal potential of video. So there are three parts of this essay, three parts of this exploration of this encounter between Cavell and Varela. The first is just a presentation of some very brief writing by Varela on his reading of Cavell, where it's notable that he's foregrounding Cavell as a philosopher of the electronic screen. The second part is my reading of The Fact of Television, but with a view to its possible connections to the work of an audiovisual artist like Varela. And then finally, I try to make some connections between The Fact of Television, as well as some other writing having to do with the social and communal potential of radio, television, mass communications, video. I try to make some connections between that and several of Varela's specific film and audiovisual projects. All of them, all of these projects notably involve found footage or reappropriated images in some way. Okay, so to sort of bring this to an end, I want to note two themes common to the two essays that I shared with the group. The first didn't click for me until I started thinking about how I would present these two essays together. And that has to do with the fact that in both essays, what I'm trying to do is bring out moments in Cavell's writing in which Cavell took seriously forms of significance other than what lies in whole films or whole works. So I already spent a lot of time talking about that as it connects to found footage and how Cavell's structure changes and allowing for the significance, the expressive significance of collections, including collections of footage, I hope. So I already talked about that, but also the thing is that, and I hope this comes out a little bit in the my essay on Bruno Varela, is that, and perhaps in Varela's reading of Cavell also, is the way in which the Fact of Television Cavell's essay, The Fact of Television, also draws attention to forms of significance that he associates with the television monitor, with the electronic monitor, namely those kinds of events whose significance cannot be understood in terms of their being situated in terms of a film or a work that we view. I mean, part of this is that Cavell makes this distinction in The Fact of Television between two modes of perception. One is viewing, which is proper to our viewing of whole films, the mode of perception proper to our viewing films, and monitoring, which is the form of perception, mode of perception proper to monitoring the electronic screen, the electronic monitor. I think part of the basis for this distinction that Cavell makes is that any question of significance in electronic monitoring, in watching something on the electronic screen, this should be very live for us because we're all presently looking at electronic screens. But any question of significance there is subordinate to questions about the significance of the event itself. So there's a difference here between the kind of significance that's proper to the viewing of a whole film, where questions of whether, say, it's not as though questions of montage or cinematography are subordinate to the contents of the shot themselves. It's more holistic. Whereas for the mode of perception proper to monitoring with the electronic monitor, according, at least as I read Cavell on these issues, those questions are subordinate to questions about the significance of the event itself. So just for example, in the live broadcast of an event, oh yes, sorry?
We're out of time.
Okay, so I just—
Give ourselves 2 more minutes.
Okay. Anyway, so I just want to say that that's one connection between the two essays is the concern with forms of significance other than what's proper to whole films or complete films. But the other is, I just want to bring it back to the question of world and worldliness, because this would connect it back to Avner's presentation, I hope. And I want to make clear that what I'm interested in showing or bringing out a loosening of Cavell's global holistic thinking as applies to films is that I do want to note that there are important aspects of his global holistic thinking that he retains throughout his entire writing, especially questions about what it is for a world to recede from view, the changing of a world of an old world into a new one, the ending of a world, the question of a world's becoming uninhabitable. This is something he says in The Fact of Television, that his hypothesis about our fears or anxieties around television, around the electronic monitor, have to do with our fears that what it monitors is the growing uninhabitability of the world. The growing, which of course need not mean a physical world, it could mean a world simply in the sense of again, a meaningful totality, that it no longer has that meaning for us, but it also has this connection to uninhabitability in the physical sense. Anyway, my conclusion is that found footage film, it's a film that consists in traces or debris taken from other films or other archival sources, at least as much as the television monitor, can be one of our natural ways of expressing our anxieties, our fascination, our relation to what it is for a world to recede from view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Byron. Just a couple of announcements, because I've been getting messages in the chat regarding the papers that have not been available to the general public, because we didn't still have a general public. Now that we do, now that you're registered and you've passed through the trial of registering into this event, I will place the papers in a folder that will be available to all of you, and I will make them. I will send them to you to your emails that we have. So don't worry about that. For the next session, you will have those. And all right. So now we are open to questions. We might start with the ones we had left from before, which was Juliet and Jonadas, Juliet and Bill, and I thought Jonadas as well. Juliet.
Thank you both. Thanks, everyone. This is just so much fun. And two beautiful papers, beautiful to set beside one another. So I'm going to sort of change my question My question will still be the question I was going to ask Avner, but I'm going to try to connect the two talks in my question and also with Nancy's comment to Avner. I want to bring up the notion of a form of life, because for me, one of the great things about Stanley's reading of Wittgenstein, he was really zeroed right in on the incredibly fundamental importance of that notion for Wittgenstein, which no other reader of Wittgenstein in the 1960s was really doing. They all thought that, you know, language games are kind of, it's all kind of language games at the bottom, but they were missing the whole embodied, expressive, human embedding of words in life, which is a dynamic evolutionary thing in Wittgenstein, as I understand it. So what I want to say is that this idea of found footage, which is just brilliantly connected, Byron, with Austin, I think that that is an absolutely brilliant metaphor for forms of life, because in reading Austin in the way Stanley does, we're cobbling it together as we go in little pieces, okay? So there might be meaning that emerges in a sense as a whole, but it can be broken off and moved, and memories are captured or alluded to, or the world is caught in that way. So I think that there's a big difference for me between forms of life and the life world of the phenomenologists. They're very different. So this is a question for both of you. They're very different, and Wittgenstein never uses the word Lebenswelt. Why? Because a life world is something, as Byron was saying, that is a totality of meaningfulness. Dasein has the hammer, you're hammering, Merleau-Ponty, you take it in. But I think, to go back to Nancy's question, the idea that in our world, we're cobbling things together and trying to figure out how to measure, so to speak, Avner. What's a long time? What's a short time? What's a big thing? What's a small thing? All of these notions are really found footage, so to speak. They're not part of a prior meaningful world. They're things we're cobbling together. And this is why skepticism is such a prevalent feature of life. So to me, it's all connected with very political things, as Nancy was saying. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir is writing about, you know, a reality she lives in that people are not attending to. But, you know, now with issues of gender, issues of measurement, access to universities, healthcare, everything, what is it to measure is an incredibly interesting question. And the found footage is one metaphorical or aesthetic way, to me, of realizing that extension of your interest. I think you should just leave analytic philosophy behind, Avner. It's okay. It'll fall of its own accord. So I'll finish.
Either one of you, Avner or Byron.
I could say something. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Juliet, that the issue of that form of life actually relates interestingly to both my paper and Byron's. I don't understand, I mean, I'm not an expert on Husserl, but I don't understand the notion of the phenomenal world in Merleau-Ponty is that different from the way you describe form of life in Wittgenstein. It's not pre-made and given and you know, identifiable apart from those moments where we, you know, take a step and find, often when something goes wrong, what it is that we've been relying on in taking that step. All that comes into play in every step we make, right? Which is, you know, the sort of thing that Byron I thought was alluding to, right? So, yeah, no, I agree. I understand form of life exactly in the way that you do, and part of what I try to bring in to the story by focusing on the 1 meter, but actually looking at the history of measurement and the different kinds of goals and the different kinds of constraints, and how, you know, the idea that we would have natural standards as opposed to conventional standards. And then we find that, you know, the difference between the two is not clear. And moreover, that what we thought would be the ideal standard is not usable in the way we had anticipated. And so in practice, we're using on other things. And I think all of that comes into play in the background as I'm thinking about it. And so connects immediately with Wittgenstein's form of life. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Byron, do you want to add something?
I guess just very briefly, I mean, I agree with Juliet, everything that Juliet said. It forces me to reconsider how perhaps notions of form of life figure in the world viewed in ways that I hadn't been thinking about yet. For example, in the essay, I say that there are some impediments when it comes to the structure of the world viewed to an approach to, say, the found footage work of someone like Ken Jacobs, the famous American experimental filmmaker, who was doing some of his most significant work around the same time as the writing of the world viewed, Cavell's work in the 70s. I think I might, and the reason why I think there are some issues here or an impediment has to do with the comparatively unedited nature of some of Jacobs's films, where using home movies, the home movies of his wife's aunt, without editing, in order to make his own film. Similarly, with his use in his film Perfect Film, use of footage having coming from that he had found 20 years after the event, news footage from the having to do with the assassination of Malcolm X, which he edited very lightly, but appropriated for his own purposes. Like I said, I think there's some impediments to an approach to that kind of film from the light of the world viewed. At the same time, maybe there's not so much in light of what Juliet said, because of the significance of forms of life in films like that. They are bearers of significance simply in virtue of their bearing or deriving something from the forms of life that they give expression to, whether they're edited or whether they rely on montage on the part of the official filmmaker or not. So I need to think more about that, about how maybe I can make an encounter even with the world viewed and that kind of film via the notion of form of life. I need to think about that.
Thank you. Jonatas?
Thanks. Hello, everybody. I had a question for Avner, and perhaps a short comment, if I may add, concerning Byron's paper. The comment is just, I would like to hear perhaps him or some of you about something that I always thought The World View is a very strange book compared to other works of Cavell, because he seems to be doing something very un-Wittgensteinian there, like defining, almost giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a film, and the other things are not films. So cartoons are not films in that sense. That always struck me as strange. You know, I tend to think that film should be taught as a family resemblance concept, and of course you can clarify portions of that family one at a time. But why is it so important for Cavell at that time to distinguish movies from other things that he doesn't want to call film? So in that sense, I really liked your paper, Byron, and brought back those questions that I had about Cavell. The question I was going to ask Avner is it's really a comment, and I would like to hear you about this. As you know, Cavell, in the beginning of his work, his early papers, especially Must We Mean What We Say and the availability of Wittgenstein's later philosophy, Cavell flirts with the idea of calling the kind of necessity that is implicit in our use of language, the must we mean what we say, he flirts with describing that as a transcendental, kind of transcendental logic, as opposed to general logic. And he refers back to Kant, and he also says that there are some parallels between what Kant calls transcendental dialectic or transcendental illusion and the pictures that Wittgenstein is trying to counteract. So in the beginning, Cavell himself was, I think, more inclined to think about his own work in connection with Kant, but that kind of it doesn't appear much in his later work. But there is one specific context that I would like to quote. Perhaps I can send a passage in the chat. In chapter 2 of Pursuits of Happiness, he talks about Kant again. And there he tries to show some important differences between what Wittgenstein does and Kant. And I think one way of presenting the difference in a general way is thinking that while Kant has a kind of wholesale method to end philosophical illusions, transcendental illusions, Wittgenstein has a more case-by-case approach, and there is no general method that we can use. And he asks a question that I would like to bring here and see what Avner has to say. He is talking about Kant's vision about our finitude, about the limitations of human knowledge, and he asks if Kant's idea of limitation should be seen as a necessary consequence of his philosophizing, or is it to be accepted rather as a Wittgensteinian picture, some sort of rigid fantasy of how things must be, itself in need of deciphering? And I think this is not a rhetorical question. I think Cavell is really, I'll send this to the host if you want to share with everybody. So I'd like to ask Avner if he has something to say about this, bring this discussion back to Cavell, Cavell's own comparison between Wittgenstein, his own work, and Kant, and similarities and differences. So I'll stop here.
Avner.
I'm sorry. I mean, there was a part of your question, Jonadas, where I wasn't sure whether Victor was going to mute or unmute me when the time comes for me to speak. And so I was extremely nervous and couldn't quite concentrate on your question. But Victor, I cannot resist this. But yes, Cavell was really, I think, maybe the first one to draw that link between the later Wittgenstein and Kant. And it's true that in one, must we mean what we say, or the availability of Wittgenstein's later philosophy, he talks about there being conditions of sense. And then very quickly, I think he says something to the effect that he's not going to try to list those conditions. All he cares about is that there are some, right? I think this is actually a very deep point, because from a later Wittgensteinian perspective, what matters is that there are, at any given moment, and for anything we might say or do next, conditions. But precisely, unlike Kant, you cannot specify those in advance. You find what they are. You find what it is you've been relying on in trying to express yourself or communicate yourself to another person. That's, yeah, I mean, as I point out in the opening of the paper, and this actually, I think, connects also with what Juliet said about form of life. There isn't like a universal, eternal set of conditions of sense. The conditions of sense, what lies in the background, is itself historically evolves. And moreover, form of life, or those conditions, are not objective facts. They're meaningful phenomena in their meaningfulness. and therefore precisely are indeterminate, open to be taken up in various ways at various moments. There is the possibility of aspect shifts as applies to those conditions. And yet it matters. I think it matters for Stanley that there are those conditions, and that a way of putting what lies at the roots of certain kinds of traditional philosophical difficulties or confusions is the denial of the conditionedness of human thinking, including the philosophers. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Avner. We have a very short time, so we have three questions. Bill Day, Thomas Arnold, and Juan Alberto Gonzalez. We could go in that order. And Bill, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I have a smallish question, possibly, for Avner on a part of the text, and then I have a kind of elaboration or suggestion for Byron on thinking about his paper. So Avner, I just want to say, like, I like the direction that you're going in, and I'm appreciating it. I'm co-teaching a course now on sort of time and the universe, and questions about measurement and how it connects up with the world are sort of central to that. They're also central in, I think, in certain ways that contemporary theoretical physicists even think about what they're doing. So I had a question on page 27 of your paper, which I will read, and then I will raise the question. It's probably, as I say, a small question, but it's a question of interest. It's a real question. You say that Kripke points out that the rod in Paris, S, might have been longer or shorter at T sub 0 than it actually was, if, for example, the temperature in the room had been different at that moment. And then you say, and that is undeniable. He goes on to say, however, that if that had happened, S would not have been 1 meter long, and that, as Diamond argues, is where confusion looms. So I think I know what you might mean by saying it's undeniable that S might have been longer or shorter at T sub 0 than it actually was. But I wonder if you could say what you mean by that it's undeniable. And then I'll turn to Byron's question.
Yeah, I mean, I confess that I am relying in saying that on Diamond's paper and on her dissatisfaction with Malcolm response to Kripke, because Malcolm thinks not even that makes sense to say that, you know, the standard might have been longer or shorter. But what matters for Diamond is what you need is a comparison. And it's not necessarily nonsensical or inconceivable to compare something with it as it might have been under different circumstances. If we know that metal rods of this material expand 0.2% when the temperature goes 1 degree, then, you know, and we know what the temperature was in the room when, you know, it was set, then we can say, you know, if the temperature had been, you know, 2 degrees more, it would have been 0.4% longer. I think so far so good. The problem, of course, with Kripke is one who say, and then it would not have been 1 meter long. And now he's relying on himself to have identified some length to which 1 meter refers and which secures the sense of that utterance. And so I'm saying this, I think, is where confusion looms. This is where he makes the slip. Does that answer your question, Bill?
Yeah, I get a sense of the distinction between he's making some sense in the first half of that claim, and it's the second half of the claim that doesn't make sense, and you're clarifying how that first half would make sense if one puts it into a context where yeah, you're saying, okay, we've done some measurements about the way this thing operates under different temperatures, and guess what? Things change.
Yeah, I mean, Diamond does it extremely effectively, I think. So if you put your hand on your head and saying, this is how tall I am, you're making no sense. But if you're saying of a child in her example, if she had taken her vitamins last year, she would have been, taller. That's fine.
So Byron, the sort of observation or way of thinking about Cavell's move away from modernism and his, let's say, problem about a certain kind of fragmentariness as a key to meaning, that I want to suggest is that it seems important that one key example besides this discussion of film in World Viewed is the way modernism is taken up in Music Discomposed in A Matter of Meaning It, where I guess one image of fragmentation that he takes issue with in certain modernist composers is the idea that they can put in moments of chance in the middle of their composition, kind of putting on the cloak of improvisation without actually doing any of the work of developing a tradition or working within a tradition of improvisation and the way that it operates, and thinking that they can mean this thing that is just, you guys just, you pick it up here and meaning will be built in because I told you to do that. And I think that's also tied to the sense of, I'm not sure if Cavell's move against modernism, and now Stephen is writing about this, if it's as much tied to what happens in film as it might be in music, because around the early 70s, actually the late 60s, there's some ways in which that modernist approach that he's critiquing in Ernst Krenek and others in Music Discomposed is already starting to lose its influence, right? There's minimalism, there's neo-romanticism. He's certainly aware of that. He doesn't speak about it, but he is, I think there's something in the way that he reads these music theory journals like for months on end, it seems, at one point, in trying to describe what moved him to write Music Discomposed. I think he's very much thinking about, and one needs to consider his interest in and the move away from modernism with respect to that.
All right.
Thank you. I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Bill.
Yes. So now Thomas Arnold.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. Thank you both for your talks. And while I haven't read the papers yet, I do want to just throw out briefly a kind of bridge piece in Cavell for me, and to see what the both of you thought, what you could make of it. And that is his essay, Finding as Founding, on Emerson. Both because of, Avner, your point about magnitude, and the measuring of distance, say I cannot get it in any closer, the loss of Waldo, and that kind of existential statement about proximity and magnitude, as well as realizing the phrase realizing your world, using world as something that could be realized. That seems to be to draw on a lot of what you're talking about in terms of the point of the world. And for Byron, just, it seems pretty obvious, but just the concept of something being found, that footage being found, seems to hit on that essay, both, there's the clear use of the word in registers, but also Emerson's struggling around the difference between the part and the whole. The essay as something that has members that you're bringing together and pulling together, and wondering how that works and to what degree that works. That seems to really, though it's not directly about film, it really calls in a lot of the themes that you were talking about. So I just, was curious what you thought, and of course, I take that offline or wherever. I know we don't have much time, but thank you.
Victor, how strict are we with the time? I mean, what's going to happen in 2 minutes?
Avner. We are scheduled until 12:30, and I was going to suggest that in the following sessions we extend it for half an hour, and this time we can stay a little longer, but I'm sure that people have made plans according to the schedule that we gave them. So whoever needs to leave before that can leave, but if we have a little bit more discussion going, well, we'll just keep
Okay, I just don't want to start talking and be afraid that I'll be cut off at mid-sentence.
You won't be muted. Don't
be misunderstood because of that.
Okay, please go ahead.
So I don't exactly remember, I don't remember well Stanley's essay on Emerson, but certainly Emerson's experience about which Stanley writes heralds, right, the kind of phenomenology that I'm arriving at in the third section of the paper. Well, the first thing is that he cannot bring his son's death closer to him, and certainly conceptualizing it, turning it into a piece of knowledge is not going to help in this matter. And the other thing is that he says, I know that the world I converse with in the cities and in the farms is not the world I think. And here, I think the world I converse with is what I understand the phenomenologists to refer to in the phenomenal world. And Emerson talks about the discrepance. One day I will know the law of this discrepance between the world I converse with and the way I think. As far as I remember, Stanley reads this sentence almost in the opposite direction from the way I do, because my sense is to read it and say, so much the worse for the world I think. And I think Stanley in this particular context reads it the other way, which is interesting to me. But I'll have to go back and make sure that I'm right about how I remember Stanley's response to that sentence in Emerson. But it's striking, that moment in Emerson. Merleau-Ponty, in the preface to the Phenomenology, says the world is not what I think, but what I live through, echoing almost exactly this sentiment of Emerson's.
Byron?
Oh, well, since I wasn't sure what was happening with time, I already expressed my gratitude to Thomas in a private chat. I think it's an excellent observation. I need to be thinking absolutely about finding its founding in connection with these issues, and Emerson in particular. I had been thinking about Thoreau in connection with these issues, especially because Cavell devotes some fascinating passages in both his collecting essay and in his essay on Arthur Danto to a comparison between passages in Walden having to do with the setting fire to debris, the setting fire to collections, the debris collected over life, and moments of setting fire to collections in Chris Marker's Sans Soleil. It's a comparison he makes in both places. And where that's exactly, when I talked about the sort of ontological issues or reconfiguring, rethinking of the ontological issues, and in Cavell's film writing that were being made explicit to me by the work of someone like Varela, it was exactly because of that, this idea of using the setting fire to a collection, so setting fire to something found as a way of figuring the powers of film. And of course, a way of figuring it that's not bound up with any kind of constraining sense of what a complete film is, but rather motivated by notions of a collection. And I think there are also some connections to Emerson here, especially since the collecting essay is partly concerned with to what extent Emerson's writing can be considered a form of collecting. It's a great suggestion. I'm definitely gonna be spending some time thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Juan Alberto González.
Good afternoon to everyone. Early show this because it's the version of how to do things with pornography. from Professor Bauer. I found that's the reason I showed this when Professor Bauer talking. I have a question for Byron. I read The Day of Tomorrow from Cavell, no, and he says in the page 2076. In Wittgenstein philosophy of the ordinary is the realm of the dead, no? Because the ordinary is, we try always to put meaning, no? A meaningful significance in the realm of the ordinary. I work try to interpret films, but in fiction films, it's very easy to create an interpretation because we have standards, like Professor Bass says, no? We have Bresson, Berman, no? When I try to explain the cinema of Wong Kar-wai, I create relation with another filmmaker, but with experimental cinema, that line, that meaning, for me, try to create that line or that significance is violence, because it's very difficult to create a standard or in this picture, in Bragach or whatever, or the filmmaker to tell us about in your text. What meaning we possibly create to distinct and said, this type of movies is like that or that? No, for me, that is violence. No, it's like Cavell says in Berman, no, with confronted to violence, with silence, excuse me, we try to put some meaning, but that is incorrect, because we only try to assume the experience and try to create something later with that experience, but no, in that moment, try to create, create the topic or category or whatever, no? Now I fight in my own thesis with that problem, with the problem of violence, try to create meaning in films, no? So always we have to tendency to create this meaning, no? That is my observation and question for Byron, no? Thanks for your time, and excuse me, my English is not very good. I learn English reading Cavell, and it's not for me very easy to talk in English, because I also have nervous, you know. No? Thanks.
Thank you, Juan.
Well, so Juan, it's great to see you again, because we were talking about issues related to this and to Cavell on film around the time of the previous Constellations of the Ordinary in 2019. So I hope we continue talking about these things. In fact, I think that one way of approaching this would be through notions of the relationship between film and, well, obviously relations between film and spectator, but also to what extent there is any kind of allowance for notions of collaboration between those two sides of the screen, as opposed to something more demarcated. And something that I do need to think about a little bit more is to what extent the demarcation is emphasized by Cavell. Obviously, when he talks about things like film as a moving image of skepticism, but there are also some other gestures, some other thoughts in Cavell that I think need to be reconstructed, but that allow for something more, something closer to a collaborative or exchange of meaning that's, I think, meant to contrast with what you call violence, and which is typically associated with experimental film, the idea that the meaning comes from, that there's room for the spectator to elaborate on the meaning of the work or of the film. And just to say that this is something I've been thinking about. So in the essay that came out of the previous Constellations of the Ordinary, I talk a little bit about a notion of modernism that seems rather different from Cavell's, but I try to make some connections to it. It's a remark that the film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum makes, made back in the 70s, when he said that he described modernism in terms of a kind of unending collaboration between artist and beholder, or artist and spectator. And again, there are reasons to think this is different from what Cavell is doing because of Cavell's emphasis on the division between spectator and film via notions like skepticism, and film as a moving image of skepticism. At the same time, I think there are some interesting possibilities for thinking of a confluence here having to do with the idea that something like if we really wanted to understand how film might escape conditions of modernism, a claim that Cavell takes up or takes seriously, even though he tends to distance himself from, it's a claim he takes up from Michael Fried. One way of understanding that would be to think exactly that if modernism is to be conceived of as a kind of collaboration between spectator and artist, then again, that would be, film would be the natural contrast with that image. Anyway, I'm not sure I'm really arriving at a clear point. I'm certain I haven't. This is not a clear point, but it's but I think it's important. I think what you're talking about whether there's room for Cavell to allow for the kind of collaborative exchange between artist and spectator, as opposed to the kinds of demarcation or violence that you're talking about. And I struggle with this. I really take it seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron. Niklas Toivaikainen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Victor, and thanks for the two papers, also the presentations. I would have I gather it's a question or a remark, or I'm searching for a response, and this is directed to Avner mostly. I just wanted to kind of see how, I mean, in the way in which, let's say, how the world is or becomes meaningful to us, how it's structured or how it's always found as significant. I'm wondering to what extent there would be, or to what extent you would kind of find it important to make a distinction between how, as it were, the world or objects talk to us, or how they're structured in our meaningful world, and on the one hand, and then other human beings or other persons, and to what extent, because your focus is here on the world in a very kind of strict sense. So I mean, just to take an example, I mean, just so how would you kind of relate what you're trying to build up to, for instance, things which Levinas would say, and I'm here thinking mostly about his idea that the face of the other is somehow meaning in itself, that there's this kind of course, I mean, in Levinas explicitly thinks of it as a kind of metaphysical idea, as opposed to an ontological idea, but anyway, that there's this kind of that there's a meaning in itself, not simply in the sense of that there's something given and we find it, but more in the sense that we're addressed, that there's something about how the world is meaningful to us is through a certain address that we are kind of faced with. So this would be just my question, that somehow it seems to me that, or this is an open question, to what extent the world or objects address us in this sense. Can they address us in the sense in which other living beings do it, and what significance would that have if there's an important difference here? So I'm just looking for a response. Thanks.
Avner, you're muted.
Yes. It's a huge question, which I don't feel I'm in a very good position to respond. I really do think it's a good question. So I'm thinking, trying to think through how far or to what extent our experience of the natural world is like our experience of another. So for example, you gave the example of things speaking to us, right? And then use that as a basis for thinking more precisely about what it is about the encounter with another that is unlike the encounter with, nature or with an object, however evocative it might be for us. But then also going in the other direction, right? And thinking about the extent to which our capacity to project sense, right? And to get the world to answer to our own questions and can sometimes infect our relations with others, right? To the point where we no longer are treating them as perceivers and responders to sense, as capable of giving things their own meaning, as having a perspective or the capacity for judgment that may contest ours. So for example, I'm thinking, Nancy talks about it, about Larsen, the real girl, and how he projects otherness onto the sex doll. And Nancy points out the extent to which this is how we mostly treat, Hollywood actresses, right? We know almost nothing about them, and yet we build a whole, fantasy, and how those fantasies that we build of others may come to suffocate them, right, in actual relationships. So I don't know, it's an extremely rich avenue to explore.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of today's session. I just want to remind you, first of all, ask you to invite whoever you want to invite for the next session, which will be in a month. And we will have Toro Moy, who will talk about Wittgensteinian phenomenology of criticism, and Stephen Affelt, who has a paper called The Pertinence of the Stars, Achieving Mortality in Little Did I Know and Only Angels Have Wings. Both, I think, are going to be extraordinary experiences, and I hope that you can come. Thank you very much for being here, and it's wonderful to celebrate Stanley with you, and I'll see you soon.
But wait, Victor, I wanted to thank you. No, honestly,
right.
Thank you for organizing this.
You're welcome, Avner.
Thank you.
All right. Well,
I anticipate that. Okay, sorry. I just want to say I anticipate a continuation of some of these themes with Stephen's paper, because having to do with,
of course.
yeah. I would just wanted to say that questions of the world receding from view and disaster and Blanchot, it's very relevant. Some things I was alluding to in my paper very relevant in Stephen. So I just wanted to make that transition because it's very important, I think.
Yeah, I hope that by the end of the 7 lectures, we will already have shared a discourse and themes and reflections. So that's the whole point. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.
Goodbye, everybody.